Welcome to our centenary event. In October 1920, a new rural charity supported by the Carnegie Trust was established. It was the Oxfordshire Rural Community Council, RCC, which celebrates its centenary this year. Oxford was shortly followed by the creation of a number of other RCCs in other counties. And so this year marks the beginning of an extended centenary celebration process across the ACRE network, supported by ACRE. I'm David Emerson, the chair of ACRE, and it's my privilege to guide you through today's event, which is the first public explanation of our hopes and ambitions for these centenary celebrations, and which we will complete just within the next hour, so you can plan your afternoon ahead. We intend that discovering the innovation and rediscovering the innovation and achievements of RCCs over the last century will provide us with both lessons and inspiration as we face the challenges ahead for rural communities in the 21st century, so that in celebrating the past, we also become better equipped for the future. We have a series of short presentations for you, but I'm very pleased that we open with a short message from Lord Gardiner, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Rural Affairs and Biosecurity, who, as all network members know, supports some core funding for each of them. So over to Lord Gardiner.
I'm very pleased to join in this virtual celebration of 100 years of rural community councils. It is a testament to the important and valuable role that they play in rural life that we have reached this momentous milestone. As many will be aware, the first Rural Community Council was established in Oxfordshire back on 7th October 1920 with funding from the Carnegie Trust. Now, rural community councils collaborate through the ACRE network, which provides coordination, policy development, and the interchange of experience within rural communities, which is so important to their survival. It is also 100 years since the start of the first National Village Halls Advice Service. This is a role undertaken now by ACRE and advisors within the rural community councils. There are some 10,000 village halls in England, which provide a hub for social and cultural opportunities and support more than 90,000 individuals to earn their living, or part of it, every year. These are really important assets we should cherish and maintain. I'm grateful that ACRE and the Rural Community Councils are helping us deliver the government's £3 million fund to provide much needed improvements to village halls. Rural Community Councils support rural life in many other ways. They've ensured the retention and revival of parish councils, helped sustain rural employment, pioneered best kept village competitions, and supported energy and fuel poverty schemes. Rural community councils have played a key role in supporting communities through the COVID-19 pandemic. In some instances, this has involved new activity. In other cases, it has meant adapting existing work so they remain able to deliver essential services to their communities. Devon Communities Together, for example, set up a local outbreak and recovery support service, which enabled tailored support to village halls, community buildings, rural businesses, and town and parish councils. Rural Action Derbyshire was the lead body for Feeding Derbyshire, which addressed food poverty. Many areas have provided training to enable groups to be able to run virtual meetings or extended their work on good neighbour schemes. Many have coordinated volunteer efforts, supported people in accessing COVID support grants, and played a key part in business response and recovery groups. I'm proud that DEFRA has funded ACRE since its inception in 1987, and that government has funded the rural community councils for significantly longer. I want to applaud the excellent work they have done over the decades, and to say thank you to all of you for everything you do, and particularly now during this pandemic. I see rural community councils as being a vital part of the infrastructure supporting our rural communities. I know that you all have a wealth of experience and unrivaled local knowledge, which is clearly so important. So thank you again for this opportunity to celebrate with you today, and I of course look forward very much to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
And my thanks to Lord Gardiner for making time for that message when he has a very busy parliamentary schedule. It is much valued. Let me now just explain how we're going to run this event. I'm chairing this from the ACRE's offices in Cirencester. I'm supported by Paul alongside me and Jeremy online. I will be joined by our Vice Chair, Jan Thornton, and we'll be dropping in 4 short films or interviews. Now, the technical format we're using allows many people to join us, but not actively to participate. However, please do use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And if you do so, some trustees who are watching will endeavour to respond, and where that's not possible, we will come back to you after the event. Now, in addition, after today's event, there is an open invitation for any former RCC staff or trustees to join a separate Zoom forum for the new alumni group, and which Doff Pollard will explain in a minute. A separate Zoom invitation has been sent for that. This is also the moment to say, perhaps with a slightly despairing shrug, that after great efforts to establish the concept of the ACRE network and its members, you are now hearing the term RCC used again, and almost interchangeably. But you know what we mean. We are the ACRE network, but many of us were RCCs. So, the planning for the centenary has started with a small group of ACRE trustees, but has rapidly expanded to a much wider group of researchers and contributors. And collectively, we've been driven by the vision and commitment of Doff Pollard, to whom I will turn in a moment for an introduction to our ambitions for the centenary. Doff herself has a long history of working in the arts in rural areas, has also been a Village Halls advisor, before becoming a CEO of the Tees Valley RCC for 12 years. And since joining the ACRE board in 2016, Doff has convened the ACRE Centenary Group. And what we have achieved so far owes a great deal to Doff's enthusiasm and energy. And we're now going to have a short recorded message from Doff. Over to you, Doff.
Thank you, David. This meeting today is a real milestone in the celebration of the centenary of the Rural Community Councils movement, which is now the ACRE network. We've been developing a number of celebration activities over the last 18 months, but as our ideas have developed, so has the world changed around us, and we've had to adapt. We see celebrating as something that people get engaged in, and it's most satisfying for them when participants get involved in actually doing it. We've set out to celebrate our past, our present, and our future, and we want to learn as much as we can to ensure we take note of those lessons. It's important to keep in mind that we're not only celebrating the first Rural Community Council starting, we're also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Village Halls Advisory Service. We decided to see what we could do using the energy of the trustees, and we have a small working group, and that group has been joined by David Clarke, Alan Rogers and David Francis, who have contributed a great deal of historical context, ideas and commitment. Our current activities include using today's event as an invitation to you to join with us and become involved in our project. We know that some of you have got precious documents stored that would be very useful if they could be shared and copied. So we want your memories, your documents and your energy. And we're also inviting you to get engaged with us in actually doing some of the activity, which will include interviewing people, writing, editing, and helping us manage some of the information. Our project will have longevity. We want it to be a real investment for the future. We want it to be something that can be accessed for research or enjoyed or just played with. So we've set up the website, which you'll hear more about later, where you'll be able to contribute to a whole variety of different sections and make it rich with your personal ideas and memories. We've got a rural historians group who are collecting material virtually so that we can access that information for use by researchers. We've got a physical archive and we want more of that, and we need help in terms of looking at how we can move that into a permanent archive. We also have an alumnus where we've already got some people involved in it, which will allow former staff and trustees to be able to meet up and be in contact with one another, and you can find out about those friends that maybe you made some years ago. We want to be able to have film events where we can show films virtually and anybody can join in looking at them, and there's lots of material in the film archives and that have been made by local film companies. We want all of this historic material to be kept safe, but also for it to be a springboard for us to use in the future for conferences and other kinds of activities. It will be that investment that ensures that the past that we've had we can use as a basis for looking into the future. We can't do this. We can't succeed without your support. So we want you to join us. In the link that you received to join this meeting, you'll also have received a briefing paper that tells you a little bit more about what we're doing and how you can be involved with us and what we're planning to do. So we need you. We really want you to be part of this celebration. So I look forward to hearing that you've joined us. Thank you.
And thank you, Doff. And how could you not join us after that persuasive invitation? Now, to give you just a flavour of some of the fascinating RCC history, and it can only be a flavour, we have two extracts from interviews for you today, the second of which, with Michael Dower, will close this event. But first, we have an extract from an interview I undertook with David Clarke, who, apart from being hugely significant in RCC history, as I explained in the interview, has undertaken an immense amount of research into the history and personality within RCCs. Before we run the interview, let me just say that both these interviews and much more besides will be available in full on the Centenary website. And if you haven't already got it, you'll have the login for that shortly. So now, here we go with my interview with David Clarke. As part of the centenary of RCCs, I'm very pleased to be able to talk with one of the seminal figures of that history, David Clarke, who was the Chief Rural Officer at NCVO and who played a part in the formation of ACRE, who was subsequently an advisor to ACRE for several years and is now actively researching the history of rural communities. Through your own experience, David, now supported by the research that you've undertaken, could I start by asking, what's your sense of what RCCs have achieved over 100 years?
I think you only have to go back 100 years and look at the huge change in rural life that's occurred, from villages which were impoverished, both financially and culturally, to the thriving communities that we see by and large in rural England today. It's an enormous achievement, and the key player has been the work of the rural community councils. It's not just the physical change, a complete network of village halls that weren't there in 1920, playing fields which we take for granted today, but again came through the work of the RCCs and the Playing Field Association, and the democracy, making things happen in village halls, adult education programs, music, drama, local history, and then bringing in schemes in terms of planning. We're often seen as being NIMBY-ish, but the work of some of the planning in the 1930s was very positive. For example, Lawrence Ramsbottom, one of my heroes, in his campaign to put electricity into the most remote rural areas, but to get there by underground rather than overhead cables. Even today, which we're campaigning in AONBs and national parks to get cables underground, but in the 30s, Derbyshire RCC was doing just that.
Wow. Well, talking of Derbyshire and counties, you yourself have enormous experience of local government. How does the role of RCCs look from that perspective?
Well, the strange thing is that there was a view in the 1920s that if you were a progressive local authority, you followed the old Chamberlain municipal socialism line, which was if you wanted to see something done, you did it yourself. If you wanted council houses, you built them, you managed them, you decided who lived in them. And you were a weak local authority that actually looked for a partner to deliver the service. So in a sense, in the 1920s, we were struggling to get grant aid from local authorities. And in many cases, RCCs that were like Dorset and Shropshire, which were formed in the 20s, actually failed in the early 30s through lack of local authority grants. But in a sense, things have changed. We've now got a culture in local government of pluralism, of working with other agencies to deliver up services. I mean, the formula that the councillors had of the rating system for most of that time, don't draw me on the poll tax, but the formula of rating guaranteed an equitable way of providing money. And through that mechanism, local authorities could deliver up money and grants to their RCCs. And of course, the RCCs had that great benefit. And it's one of the factors that has changed the nature of the local authorities' relationship with the voluntary sector. In the early days, Carnegie, and then after it, the Rural Development Commission said, right, we will fund you on condition that the money that we put in is matched or part matched by your local authority. And that gave the local authority to say, well, this is obviously a much more cost-effective way of delivering a service. If somebody else is paying half the cost, that we as a local authority have got to pay it all. So I think that's changed a great deal. And of course, you mentioned local authorities. I mean, my 30-odd years time as a councillor is not just as a county council and district council leader, it's also as a parish councillor. And in the 1920s, parish councillors were being written off as failures. And it was the likes of the RCC secretaries who picked up parish councils, dusted them off, and gave them a new lease of life. And of course, delivered up the National Association in the 1940s. All that work was done by the RCC movement. We ran the parish council support service. We created the county committees. We then created the national body. And my predecessor sent off his deputy to be the head of NALC in 1947. So we've had a great part in that. And I think the local authorities today, there was a period in the 1970s after reorganisation where we had two tiers of very powerful authorities, well-resourced authorities, where the county and the district councils were both contributing to the work of RCCs. But unfortunately, local authorities are now reduced in stature, I suspect, and certainly reduced in funding. And so it is a more challenging time for rural community councils or the network members to be able to deliver the service relying upon the support of their local authority. I'm sure the local authorities still wish the RCCs well, wish that they can deliver services, but don't frankly come up with the checkbook in the generous terms that it was there in my day in Bedford Square. Something which I deeply regret.
Yeah, thanks. Now, you and I both know that to deliver successful policies, it needs skilled and sensitive practitioners. Can you remind us of some of those key personalities in the world? You've mentioned one already in the RCC world over that century.
Can I highlight three? Because if I was to go on beyond three, I would get into many hundreds. I think the first was Grace Haddow. She was the first RCC secretary. She managed to be a secretary for 9 years and doubled up as chief rural officer based in Oxford initially, and then in London, and also was very involved as an academic in Oxford. And she was, I think, her biography has slipped from the bookshelves, so my knowledge of the detail of her work, but I was impressed that she went off to Winchester to an evening meeting to establish the Hampshire RCC back in the 1920s. And the idea of a single lady jumping on a train in Oxford to go off to an evening meeting and then come back, presumably in the dead of night, it leaves me with, having travelled a few late night meetings myself, I'm very impressed with that. The second is certainly Lawrence Ramsbottom. I mean, for me, Grace Haddo came from a very strong middle-class background. Her father was a county clergyman. Her brother was the Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield University. So she had private means. But Lawrence Ramsbottom was for the son of somebody who working in the bleach works in Lancashire, a very rotten job. His father was a Methodist lay preacher, and he was a journalist, but wasn't a university graduate. He joined the YMCA, which has an important part in the history of the RCC movement, and was secretary in Monmouthshire and then secretary in Derbyshire and then chief rural officer. 18 years at the helm. And his achievements are incredible. I mean, there's a story of when he persuaded the Duke of Devonshire to provide access to the Chatsworth estate. Now, in the 1930s, there was the Kinder Scout movement to trespass on Kinder Scout in order to get access. And that gets all the credit now. But Lawrence Ramsbottom, as the county RCC secretary, ran a campaign to walk in the countryside, to get people walking, not just on the rights of way which parish councillors accepted were there, but also persuading landowners to allow people, effectively, it's the right to roam, but it's the right to roam long before the Crow Act was actually on the books. So his achievements there, the YHA movement, he managed to persuade landowners to actually give up 5 stately homes in the Peak District to become youth hostels. And I was actually a warden in my early youth, a youth hostel warden, where Lawrence Ramsbottom had persuaded the stately homeowner that it was more useful to be a youth hostel than to be a largely empty place for the occasional grass moor. So he was a real giant. I mean, every way. He did a weekly radio program on the BBC on rural life, and he wasn't alone. There are others that are doing that. He picked up the parish council movement and really made a big difference to it. Adult education. I mean, if you look at his diary, which we've only got from the newspaper reports, he would do a meeting in the north of the county, which would go on till late at night, get back to his office in Derby, and then next morning would go off somewhere else to another daytime meeting. So an incredibly hard-working man who had tragically died in a railway accident in a blackout in 1942. Had he not died, I think the RCC movement would have been even stronger in the post-war period. And then my third, and the man who persuaded me to apply to be chief rural officer, maybe some would say, well, this guy should not be highlighted, was Alec Trotter, who worked in the RCC movement for almost 40 years and was a tireless campaigner. You've heard from Michael Dower that Michael, of course, was the third generation of the Trevelyan's and the Dowers to have Alec sitting on one of their committees. But he was a very bright guy. He did some great work on rural transport, battles to improve bus services in Northumberland in the 1950s. He was instrumental in the work to develop the Kielder Reservoir and the communities there. And of course, he was the guy who kept badgering away to provide a voice for the Rural Community Council movement, which led eventually to the creation of ACRE in 1987. So, and unfortunately, we've just heard that he died last year. He'd moved down to Sidcup in outer London and died. But he was one of many, but he's the one who, for me, is particularly significant, if only because, as I say, he not only persuaded me to apply, but also carried on backing me at a time in NCSS when there were many people who didn't want me to succeed.
So we know who to blame. We haven't talked about this before, but both of us now are involved in ensuring that there's some kind of celebration and mark of the centenary. And the reason we're doing this, as we both know, is as much about the future and where we can go and what the lessons are from the past. A bit unexpected, but if I ask you now, in the light of all that you've seen and read and understood, what would be your thoughts and hopes about what we can take from this history going forward for what is now the ACRE network?
I think my first would be to say that whilst the issues that created RCCs in the 1920s have all changed, there are still new rural issues to be addressed. I would first say, don't stop thinking that rural is important. The very fact that now RCCs are increasingly local development agencies with an urban and rural role, there are still some key rural issues. Village halls still need to be sustained. There are still communities with village halls that are nothing more than the old tin huts from the 1940s. They're more and more are being replaced. There are some magnificent halls being built, often with lottery funding. But you've still got to recognise that there are new issues. I wrote a book a few years ago about good neighbours, and the Good Neighbours scheme has now been adopted by about 15 RCCs as a way of actually bringing in a new way of giving support. There's an argument, when I was reviewed by Jimmy Young of all people, he said, "Oh well, we don't need organisations. We've all got good neighbours take place in rural communities." They don't. A lot of people can get left and neglected. So actually having an organised structure, an informal group that provides support for transport, for caring, for visiting, and in these days, even for making contact with people who are isolated, that I think is really important. Michael Dower has made reference to climate change, which in the broader remit, the work of Rhys Taylor and Rural Action needs to be pursued and continued in rural communities. That won't go away. We still have to address the issue of rural transport. The WIs are now running a campaign to bring back bus services. And I get a feeling that there's some resistance in rural communities from actually providing the kind of comprehensive bus service that is needed if we are to get away from our dependence on the car. I mean, I'm a regular bus user, even in lockdown. I still be seen on the bus service, but there's a role there to be fulfilled, and many more. And still democracy. The governance of some rural communities, although it's much better than it was 100 years ago, there are still some people trying to run things on the basis of giving power to one person and assuming that that one person can speak for and make judgments on behalf of the whole community. That's never healthy. We really have got to broaden democracy. And that isn't a reference to what's going on elsewhere in national life.
David, that's a wonderful coverage. Thank you so much. And hearing that again, I just love those stories about Lawrence Ramsbottom. My thanks to David for his time and his huge contribution to all our research activities and achievements. And for the sharp-eyed amongst you, did you notice that coincidentally, both David and I had Alan Rogers' History of the Development Commission propped up on the shelves behind us. Just one of many parts of the archive. Now, at the heart of the centenary are two elements, together reflecting communication across this 100 years. They are a book and a website. So starting with the book, that's one major output of the centenary. And it's a book to celebrate 100 years of the RCCs, which is being written for us by another trustee, Professor Nigel Curry. And with my further great thanks to him, I turn to a little presentation from Nigel now.
Thanks for the introduction, David. The Centenary Committee decided that a book about rural community councils would be a useful centenary contribution. This would tell the stories of some of the salient events and people of the RCC movement over its first 100 years. We have settled on the title Reaping a Community Harvest, and whilst I've taken the lead in drafting the volume, there's been a substantial input from those who were there at the time, so to speak. Particular contributions have come from David Clarke, Chief Rural Officer at the National Council for Voluntary Organisations in the 1970s and 1980s, Alan Rogers, the founding chair of ACRE and sometime chair of Kent RCC, and David Francis, a founding ACRE trustee and sometime chief officer of Northumberland RCC. Many individual RCCs also have had an important input, recounting salient highlights of their work since their formation. And of course, there's a lot of published material to draw on. The volume is broadly chronological, but it's also thematic. It begins by summarising some RCC antecedents, including the establishment of parish councils, the growth of rural organisations, demographic change, and the establishment of the National Council for Social Service under the chair of W.G.S. Adams, to the left on this slide. He would be instrumental in working with Grace Haddow, on the right on this slide, to establish the first RCC in Oxfordshire in 1920. Chapter 2 charts this formation and assesses the establishment of a range of RCC portfolios up to the Second World War, in rural industry, as in Oxfordshire on the left of this slide, village halls, adult education and social organisation, such as the development of mobile cinemas, as on the right in this slide, in Essex. Wartime RCC work, particularly relating to the evacuation of children and the growing of food, also is assessed. Post-war activities to 1970 feature in Chapter 3, which also includes the dates of formation of RCCs. Rural repopulation, a new No Rural Development Planning System and the introduction of the welfare state would adjust the priorities of RCCs to a degree. For example, Durham RCC's fight to save Category D villages in Durham and Lancashire RCC's development of childcare. Chapter 4's coverage of the period to 1995 charts the introduction of countryside offices into RCCs, the growth in area designations for the rural economy, and changes at the top leading to the creation of ACRE. The rolling back of the welfare state in this period triggered further adjustments to RCC priorities. Rural services came to the fore, and community-level planning, for example village appraisals, was in the ascendancy. Chapter 5, in recounting the period from 1995 to the present day, examines the rise of citizenship and the RCC response, as well as the decline and fall of rural governmental organisations. The necessary move of RCCs towards more business-facing operation is evaluated, which has led to a number of RCC partnerships, collaborations and even mergers, such as in Norfolk. The huge diversity of RCC work today is portrayed in the final chapter, from preschool nurseries in Dorset to renewable energy in Lancashire, from emergency assistance for flooding in Somerset to support for fishing communities in Cornwall. Some future challenges facing RCCs into their second century also are offered. The book is lavishly illustrated with nearly 100 photographs, drawing on some great archive material contributed from RCCs themselves and from other collections. It also has a further reading section in which some lesser-known little gems are described. It will be available in the late spring of 2021.
And my great thanks to Nigel for all the time and effort he's putting into that book. Alongside that, then, we have the creation of a website, which can provide both a way into all of the research collected, as well as an outward face of the event and the one place where your own recollections and inputs can go if you desire. And Jan Thornton returned just in time, as you saw. Our ACRE Vice Chair is supporting Doff and our website guru, Ant Smith, on the creation of the website. And I've asked Jan if she would explain a little more about it. And so, Jan, back with us. How did the idea of the new ACRE Centenary website come about?
Just before we start, can I just say, I was getting my husband to switch his audio off so we don't have feedback. That was all. I've been here all the time. So, right, the idea for the Centenary website. Well, the original plan was to bring together former colleagues from across the network for a conference and a centenary event to mark the establishment of the RCCs 100 years ago. Well, for obvious reasons, of course, that plan wasn't able to go ahead. So then Doff came up with this excellent suggestion of a plan B, which I have to say, I think was a better idea than the original plan A, because it's going to have greater longevity and is going to be really widely accessible. And the working group for the website development actually found it's a really positive antidote to lockdown boredom. So that was good. And it's also enabled us to find willing volunteers to help. But we've also realised that we've now created this enormous space. People are going to be able to contribute as much or as little as they would like.
So far, so very good. So what then is the aim of the website, Jan?
Right. Well, it's a platform on which together we can all celebrate the achievements and successes of the RCCs from 100 years ago to the present day. So, and it's also going to allow us to acknowledge the challenges that rural communities have had across the decades, and also to use the insight to look to how we can use experience from the past to help tackle future challenges and issues. And we also hope it's going to be a catalyst for future engagement of interest in the material archive that David Clarke and his willing band of voluntary rural historians are collating for posterity.
And so, Jan, how do you hope to achieve that?
Well, we've been really fortunate in procuring the services of Ant Smith, who's previously worked on some really prestigious projects for the BBC. And he's created space for national themes, as well as devoting pages for each individual, or a page for each individual ACRE network member. So, for example, national themes will be things such as village halls, parish councils, community transport, community-led planning. The list is really long. There's lots and lots of choice. And the ACRE network member pages, they're going to provide the individual organisations with the space in which to mark either their own centenaries or other significant anniversaries or milestones. And it's going to enable celebration of reminiscences and anecdotes. And they can take the form of video, audio clips, essays, previously published documents, a whole host, a veritable smorgasbord of material.
And I believe from what you said to me earlier, Jan, you have already got a pilot page up and running?
We do indeed. And we chose village halls, probably for obvious reasons. And there's a couple of stories there already. One of them is celebrating the legacy from World War I. And the other is an article that was published by a former village halls advisor from a trip to Northumberland village halls in 1996. In addition, we've got a link to a blog that's on the ACRE website about how community halls have been, what they've been doing during the pandemic. And we've also got a clip from village hall activities a video clip of village hall activities in 1986, courtesy of the Windrose Rural Media Trust. And we've even got a photograph, a black and white photograph of people playing carpet bowls in a village hall in Cleveland in about 1985. And the man at the front is wearing a very dodgy jumper. And I think my dad had one very similar to that. So what I really think is important before I finish to emphasize is that there's no deadline to all of this. We don't want people thinking, oh, I haven't got the time in the next 12 months to contribute all of these things. We're hoping this is going to be a project with longevity that's going to carry on for a number of years, and that it can be added to when it's appropriate for each individual organisation, or when they can find the volunteers to help contribute towards it. And we're really excited about it. And we've barely started yet, but we've already had this as a catalyst for two wonderfully new, proactive and vibrant groups in the alumni and the rural historians.
Jan,
can we have the slide, please, Jeremy?
Thank you. And the slide. There we go. So that's the URL you need to keep, but we'll let you have it again. Thank you. Jan, thank you so much, and thank you to Ant and to Doff. I know you've done a huge amount of work putting into the website, and really excited, like you, what's going to happen. Thank you. So now we come to our final insert, and it's an interview Louise Beaton undertook, one of our trustees, with Michael Dower. Louise will introduce Michael, but what struck me about the interview is the parallels that Michael draws between RCC and ACRE history and some current issues, as well as his pleas for the key issues on which we really need to be working. So that interview, please.
It is a great joy for me to interview Michael Dower, CBE, for the ACRE Centenary Celebration. I had the privilege of learning at the feet of this great man with ACRE's forerunner, the NCVO Rural Department, in the mid-1980s, and then getting to know him and his lovely wife, Nan, during some immensely enjoyable trips with the European Rural University. And I distinctly remember the community singing launched by Michael on coaches and in cafes in some far-flung venues. Now, why interview Michael for the centenary? Well, Michael's involvement in the ACRE network is a family affair going back over the whole century. His grandfather, Charles Trevelyan, was a cabinet minister when the government said every county should have a rural community council. And the ACRE network has benefited significantly from your academic background, Michael, and that academic on-the-ground partnership that we have in influencing rural policy today. So, Michael, I wanted to ask you, how did you become involved with NCVO's Rural Department and with David Clarke and come to form Rural Voice?
The government began introducing policies which were doctrinaire, city-based, and didn't take account of rural needs. I'll give you quick examples later, but and NCVO was extremely concerned that this was happening. I think I'm right in saying that NCVO had a rural committee chaired by my longtime family friend, John Cripps, Sir John Cripps. Nicholas Hinton, the director of NCVO, and David thought that they ought to do something about this, that the only way to influence the Thatcher government would be to bring together a powerful coalition of rural organisations. John Cripps didn't want to get involved further in that. My friend Chris Seeley, the director of the Dartington Hall Trust, was a friend of Nicholas Hinton, and he suggested that I might do that job, working with David. And John Cripps, who, as I say, was a long-term family friend, said, Michael Dower's okay. So they asked me to set it up. And we got together with a few people whom no doubt you'll allow me to name. And we began to think, what about a name for it? Well, it was the time of the militant tendency in Liverpool, and we thought for a moment about calling it the Rural Tendency, but then we thought probably not a good idea. So we'd call it what it obviously was intended to be, namely Rural Voice, and off we set, together with representatives of the 10 organisations, national organisations, who between them had 850,000 members, which was quite a political force, including the then 380,000 members of the Women's Institutes, which was a joy.
And what do you feel are the prime achievements of Rural Voice?
Well, we blocked the three things which offended us most in the proposals by the Thatcher government. First, they introduced for the first time the sale of council affordable houses, and we knew that that would have a very serious impact upon the stock of affordable houses in the villages. So we persuaded them to exempt settlements of 3,000 or less, which happens to be the size of the town where I now live, Beminster in Dorset. The second one was that they introduced a charge for children's transport, use of school buses, for children who live less than 3 miles from a school, which would have a devastating danger of young children, if the parents couldn't afford it, and why should they afford it, walking along rural lanes in the dark at night. And the third one was the most subtle, and I always use it as an example of the unintended consequences of government policy, is that they propose to replace weekly payments of pension by cash with monthly payments by cheque. And of course, many old people in the villages didn't have bank accounts, they didn't have liquidity. But more important, or equally important, the loss of that weekly cash payment business for post offices was going to seriously damage the income of post offices. Well, we beat all three of those. But the much more long-term, the much more significant achievement was getting these different networks with their 850,000 members to recognize the need for self-help by rural communities. So we published books on alternative rural services, on solutions to housing, and on job creation in rural areas. That very much influenced my subsequent work in Europe in particular.
Now, I don't think you had a direct role in the emergence of ACRE itself, but I wonder if you could look back and tell us how you feel the ACRE network and ACRE itself looked from where you worked at Dartington, then at the Countryside Commission, then at the University of Cheltenham and Gloucester, where you were a professor, or now as an environmental activist in Dorset. Has it changed much?
Well, the RCC family is essentially pursuing the same mission as before in very changed circumstances. That's what I would like to focus on. I mean, my work at the Countryside Commission at Dartington was largely environmental, recreation, tourism, countryside management, those things which weren't in the RCC field. Looking ahead, I'm friendly with Alex Pico of the Dorset Community Action. And came across him a good deal because we were together on the leader group, the Southern Dorset Rural Action Group, Local Action Group, of which I was vice chairman. But what really concerns me now, I mean, thinking strategically about well-being of rural communities, which is what has driven me through the whole of this process, a so-called localism agenda without the resources to really pursue it properly. Local government reform, or rather local government bleeding of money, which has left them incapable of doing much beyond their statutory duties. The loss of the Rural Development Commission, which was a very precious force, in my view, for the well-being of the rural communities. And at the moment, complete uncertainty about the Shared Prosperity Fund and what it's going to look like as a successor to all the European money which was flowing into the rural areas. And in that context, the importance of civil society organizations, including the rural community councils, to support them and catalyze them is even more vital than before.
Thank you very much for those thoughts, Michael. Anything else you would like to leave us with about the change since the days when your grandmother and mother were involved for the future?
As a 65-year-old, 65 years career I've had in planning, I've always been convinced and seen planning as a positive force for the creation of the right development, for promoting the right development, not for stopping development, and for reconciling folk, work and place in the Gadesian mode, the three sides of the great equation, the social, environmental and economic. And for example, when I was the National Park Officer in the Peak District, I turned that board effectively into a development agency in the Peak Park. So this demonizing of planning and worse, this grossly simplistic proposal, which is currently being debated, of the new planning regime with the simplistic zoning is grotesque in my view, gravely damaging. But I'm appalled by the sort of laissez-faire environment in which we operate, and the absence of a real determination to make things better by positive action, as distinct from leaving it all to private enterprise.
Mm. Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael, for your thoughts. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you today.
Pleasure.
And we're recording this in advance, but I very much hope we're going to have you with us at our centenary celebration when this will be shown to everybody else. So thank you, Michael, and
Thank
very
you.
best wishes.
Bless you, and thanks.
And as indeed we have just shown it, and I just reiterate my thanks to Michael for his time and for his wisdom and insights. And just to remind you that the full interview with David Clarke, both of those and other material are available on the website, and that URL you saw previously. So as we come to the end, let me just make a few final comments. The Rural Community Council Network has been and remains as the ACRE Network, a remarkable and very special group of organisations supporting rural communities. And we want the centenary, as I said initially, to explore and celebrate that history, and thereby to enable us to be even more effective in the future. But this needs to be a collective enterprise. So in thanking you for being with us today, may I also emphasize that we would love your further participation in whatever way and with whatever time you have available and works for you. But before we close, first, I just want to thank behind the scenes work today from Jeremy and Paul, who've made this work extremely smoothly, for whom we're really grateful for all the preparation and time they've put in behind this event. And I also want to bring in Dov and Jan, invite them to say a few final words. First of all, Dov.
Let's get started. I'm really looking forward to the idea that some of you will have been inspired to want to share some of this with us. You should have received an invitation to a Zoom meeting where you can see one another. And so I look forward to seeing some of you there. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Dov. And Jan?
We'd really appreciate your support with this project. And please will you spread the word to as many of your former colleagues as you can, because that's how it's going to work if we can get it out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. And very finally from myself, this is a rare moment and it's a rare opportunity. Centenaries, a definitive once in a lifetime experience. So together, let us make the most, the very most of this centenary and what we can gain from it. Thank you again for being with us today, and all best wishes from the ACRE team. Goodbye for today. Thank you.